First up is the new film MaXXXine, and this is the third of T.I. West's horror trilogy starring Mia Goth. And I am not a horror person. If you've listened to my reviews before, you know that I am generally a giant scaredy cat, and so I don't particularly like films in this genre. I respect them because they do their job very well, but it takes a lot for me to voluntarily go see a film like this. However, I saw the MaXXXine trailer. I had heard wonderful things about X and Pearl, the other two in the series, and I went, okay, this is really interesting. I think I'm just going to step outside of my comfort zone for this one and go see it. Now, in preparation for it, because I had not seen the others, I watched X and Pearl, and I thought, these are really great films. I understand what the hubbub was. I think there's a world in which if I had seen them at the time and if I had, been more active in the horror genre, I would have thought maybe they would have gotten a tiny bit overhyped, but watching them back to back, I went, oh wow, these really work as complementary explorations. I can't wait to see what they do in MaXXXine. I will say now that, unfortunately, I think MaXXXine is by far the weakest of the trilogy. The thing about Pearl and X is that Pearl is a prequel, but also not necessarily like a direct prequel to X. Like, you could understand the events of Pearl on its own, and you could understand the events of X on its own. And stepping into MaXXXine, you do really need to have seen X for it to make sense, which I understand. That is what a sequel is. However, it doesn't do a really good job of incorporating the themes and the plot points that happened in X that lead to MaXXXine. And if you're completely unfamiliar and you are like me and you're like, oh, this looks interesting, maybe I'll go see it. MaXXXine is about Maxine Minx, played by Mia Goth. She stars in the film X, which was, like I said, the first one of these, and she's just determined to be a star. She starts out as an adult film actress, but she still wants to break into the mainstream. MaXXXine is set considerably after the events of X, which took place in a small, farmhouse, etc. This is taking place in Hollywood in the 80s, and the other thing to note is that it's set against the background of the Night Stalker, who was a real serial killer, so there should be this inherent sense of suspense and drama and all this stuff, but it just all felt missing, and it felt like in this one, T.I. West did not trust his audience, which is, I think, one of his strengths in the first two films is that he doles out information just when you need it, versus this one where there's so much exposition, especially from Elizabeth Debicki plays a character who is, a director of a horror film within this horror film, so she is the T.I. West character, effectively. The fact that she's just constantly monologuing in it in order to basically catch us up or tell us what T.I. West is thinking, this is one of those moments where he's telling me, not showing me, which is one of my kind of pet peeves when it comes to filmmaking, because I'm like, you have this opportunity to just have it play out. You've proven to us you can do this in a tactful way. What happened between the last one and this that made you lose that faith in the audience, in your ability to lean on the plot itself versus expositional dialogue? I don't know what happened, but it happened, and so I think this is by far the least clever. This one I'm the least emotionally invested in. I think the horror parts even, which I'm not a huge fan of, but at least I understood the purpose and peppering in of them in the first two films, doesn't feel like an evolution here. It actually feels like he's regressing. I don't know what happened, T.I. West. Come on. Mia Goth is the highlight of this film. I think her ability to inhabit the micro moments of this is really her strength. And then, like I said, you've got Elizabeth Debicki, who is fine in this. I don't blame her for this. I think I blame, the dialogue and the directing here. You've also got Moses Sumney, Michelle Monaghan, Bobby Cannavale, Halsey, Lily Collins, Giancarlo Esposito, and Kevin Bacon. And Kevin Bacon I will bring up later in a different movie. But you have these really talented supporting casts, and yet they all feel the most one-dimensional out of any of the three films. Like in the other films, Mia Goth's Maxine Minx or Mia Goth's Pearl are the star of the film, but I felt like even if I only got micro moments with some of the other characters, they felt like fully fleshed out characters. This one, I'm just like, you are just a cardboard cutout of what T.I. West thinks this character should be. I don't want to call it a fall from grace. It's not the worst movie, but it's certainly nowhere near the levels of the other films. And again, I would imagine that because of the success of the other two, he was given more free reign with this. Maybe it's just suffering as a victim of your own success and wanting to recreate this lightning in a bottle thing. And he managed to sort of do it with the fact that he made the prequel. But, making a sequel, maybe the character story was done. I do think, this is not a spoiler, but there is a poetic justice about the fact that this is being made about wanting to be a star, and then this character who is just constantly being set back, and then the last one is just I guess not everyone gets their Hollywood ending in terms of T.I. West's story, but yeah, if you're a huge fan of the other two, I imagine just the morbid curiosity is going to force you to see this film, but I think there's a world in which you could just accept the first two as a beautiful duo versus this trilogy. If you were like me and you were like, ooh, this trailer actually looks really interesting and different than the other two, I'm going to say, no, do not see this film. But I would suggest you see X and Pearl because, like I said, even as somebody who is, terrified of this genre, I was like, ooh, these other two are really good films. So I'm glad that in preparation for MaXXXine, I went on the journey of watching X and Pearl. But MaXXXine itself, I think, is not a fitting conclusion. I think this storytelling group deserved better. I'm going to give it a 2.5 out of 5. I'm so sorry. I think if I'd watched it in a vacuum without, maybe I would have given it a tiny bit of a higher score. But because it's a sequel to one of the films as a part of a grouped trilogy, you know that this was his goal, and therefore I have to kind of evaluate them as a group. So 2.5 out of 5. I'm so sorry, MaXXXine. The next film I have is an animated film called The Imaginary, and it's from Studio Ponoc. And you may not have heard of Studio Ponoc before. They are relatively new. They are made from a bunch of Studio Ghibli alumni, and I think one of my favorite fun little stories about it is, a bunch of them when The Boy and the Heron, which is Miyazaki's last film, it went on some sort of break, and so a bunch of these animators were released into the wild, and a bunch of the animators and creatives went, you know what, let's just keep working and make our own film. So they started on this, and then suddenly The Boy and the Heron went back into production, and I would assume out of respect for Miyazaki, a bunch of them just went back and helped finish the film. So this movie looks very much like a Ghibli film. It has that aesthetic influence. You would look at it and you would go, oh, this must be the latest Ghibli film. It's not, but it certainly shares a DNA with the kind of creative aesthetics of that studio. Now, let's talk about the heart of it, because that's the most important part to me, right? Like, anyone can try and ape a style, but can you capture the heart of something like a Ghibli film? The answer is sort of. This is based on a book. It is directed by Yoshiyuki Momose, who has done a few other films. He did Modest Heroes, Tomorrow Leaves. Nothing is quite at the Ghibli recognition level, but the story is creative, and this is our second film in however many months about imaginary friends, and I think this is certainly the far superior film. It centers around a character named Amanda, who imagines up an imaginary friend named Rudger, not to be confused with Roger, it is Rudger with a U, and basically we go on a journey about how the world of these imaginary friends operate. There is also a anti-hero slash villain, I would call him, which I don't want to give too much away, but he comes into play pretty early, and I was like, oh, this is kind of scary. Like, if you were a young kid, you would definitely be scared by this. They are not pulling punches when it comes to just like the terrors of this, which I thought was great. Although if you have really young kids, be prepared for maybe 1 or 2 nightmares. I like the world of the imaginary that they built in this. I think it makes much more logical sense than the one of If, which is the one I'm referring to that we saw earlier this year. Also, the characters are so much more appealing. Like, that was one of my big beefs with the film If. I was like, these are just horrifying and ugly, and I know you're trying to be funny maybe for a slightly older audience, but like, do you really think this is what kids dream up when they think about imaginary characters versus this one where you're like, oh my god, that's adorable, it's fun, and I could totally see why you would dream that up, and I totally want a stuffed animal of that. I'm not gonna lie here. So you've got this adventure. I don't want to go too much into the details. I think there are some very emotional and mature plot points in it, not mature in a sense of like, ooh, this is inappropriate for kids, but just, there are concepts that younger children especially are going to be confronted with maybe for the first time that, if you're a parent, you might have to do some explaining for. The idea of legacy and memory and all that type of stuff. I cried during the first time I saw this. And then, like I said, one of my favorite parts of it is that it is not all sunshine and daisies and sugar-coated, and I give credit to the character of Mr. Bunting, who is spooky as hell, and voiced by Jeremy Swift from Ted Lasso, who is Leslie Higgins, who is the most delightful, quiet, soft-spoken character in that, and so to see him display his range in this, I was like, okay, Jeremy. You've also got Haley Atwell, Cal Penn, and LeVar Burton providing some of the English language voices. I think it's a well-thought-out film. I don't have any emotional attachment to the source material, so I can't speak to it as an adaptation. Visually, I saw an illustration from the original kind of children's book, basically, that this is from, and I was like, this looks nothing like what, that style is. So if you are a fan of the original source material, just know this is a very different visual adaptation, but I do think it is worth watching. It is out on Netflix, and I'm going to give it a 3.9 out of 5. My last film this week is Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F, and this is a continuation of the Beverly Hills Cop series, which I will fully acknowledge I don't have nostalgia for. I think I maybe saw the first one at some point in my life, but I've certainly not seen any of the sequels, just because I'm a little young for it, and so I just, whatever. It was not on my radar, so I think one of the things about this film is I will give it credit in that I understood what was happening pretty easily without having seen the other films and or having seen the other films in a very long time. Eddie Murphy returns as Axel Foley, our titular Beverly Hills Cop. You've also got a bunch of the other characters who are returning. This is basically, I don't want to say pulling people out of retirement because I do think these folks are still working, but, you've got Judge Reinhold, John Ashton, Paul Reiser, and Bronson Pinchot, and I could tell just from, oh my God, this is going to sound so mean, but just like the meltiness factor of some of them that they are from earlier in this series. Like without knowing the history, without having seen it, I was like, oh, you are clearly, being brought back as either a favor or a nostalgia play or whatever. I think they did fine, right? And I think the film does a fine job of just being like, look, here are these characters who like each other. They clearly have a history. We're not going to go into super detail about it, but if you're familiar with them, fine. If you're not, like I was just like, okay, I get it. You're not beating me over the head with it, thankfully, which I actually really appreciated, but you're giving me like a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Joining this franchise is Taylor Page as Jane Foley, who plays Eddie Murphy's daughter, Joseph Gordon-Levitt as another detective in Beverly Hills, and then Kevin Bacon, who, like I said, appears in MaXXXine, and we're going to talk about him again. His character in MaXXXine is this almost unrecognizable Southern, smarmy, swarmy, like sketchy character. This one, he's a very clean, bougie police officer. Just like, oh, Kevin, I think I liked you better as the gross dude in this. Much like MaXXXine, actually. This film doesn't necessarily trust its audience that much. I don't know if the other ones in this do, so I can't speak to that factor of it, but it gets telegraphed pretty early who is a good guy and who is a bad guy, and there's not a lot of like red herrings or, ooh, could this person have turned bad from earlier in the series? No, it's delivering what I assume is the same formula as the other ones. So you're here to see Eddie Murphy, right? Because that's the nostalgia factor. I think he was fine in this. I'm evaluating this as a effectively first entry into the franchise for me. I was glad he was actually, I'm not going to say muted, but he was giving a controlled performance that I was not expecting. I thought this was going to be like super over the top Eddie Murphy, which maybe it's just because he's, his character is showing its age, or maybe just Eddie Murphy is just toned down a little bit, or maybe he has figured out how to meter his performances better. But is this movie worth watching? Whether or not you are a huge fan of the franchise is its own question, right? I think the problem with it is that, trying to weave in nostalgia characters aside, it was trying too hard to be like, we're a real movie. And so all of the action and chase and all those sequences go on too long and simultaneously are overdone, but you're like, this cannot be happening in Beverly Hills. Like, again, maybe in the earlier entries into the franchise, you'd be like, yeah, the Wild West of LA, sure. But modern day Beverly Hills, I'm like, this doesn't work in a day and age of, and they sort of try to address this, but like cell phones everywhere and like just the density of population and, bumper to bumper traffic, like, these chase scenes and all this action doesn't work. And I think they're trying to compensate for the plug and playness of the script with being like, but no, look, the action has gotten even better. But it's not compelling and it doesn't really drive the story forward. So I just kind of wanted to fast forward. And you do have the ability to do that because it is on Netflix through those sequences. And get to some of I think the better moments that work are the kind of dynamics between characters, the father-daughter moments between Eddie Murphy and Taylor Page, even the Joseph Gordon-Levitt character being inserted into that dynamic is just, that's where I'm not going to say shines would be too generous, but that's where it succeeds in what it's trying to do. The rest of it is kind of falling very, very flat. Overall, even I think if you were a huge fan of this franchise, sometimes it's one of those things where you're just like, just let it be. Like with MaXXXine, I'm just like, you could have stopped and it would have been fine. I'm only going to give this a 2.8 out of 5.